Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. I'm going to continue with this paper that I finished in 2016, and toward the end I'm talking about a sign of the addiction syndrome, or you could call it the reward and punishment syndrome. Another sign is denial. For example, denial of global warming. This denial was paid for. In other words, there was a whole project of denial. It was paid for, at least in part, by one of the Koch brothers who had earned money from oil. And the denial is a very essential part of addiction, because a person who's addicted is in denial as to what's happening addicted, for example, to a drug, what's happening to his body at the same time that he feels all this well-being. He doesn't think about the fact that his body is getting worse and worse, and if it keeps going, it'll eventually lead to death. He's not thinking about that. He's denying it. Another denial lasted a while when the owners of American football denied the connection between players' injuries, head injuries, and the serious problems that developed later on. But now they do accept that, so that is a step in the right direction. Another sign of the presence of this rewards and punishment syndrome is the willingness to do violence to persons if necessary to obtain the object of the addiction. War is an example of this, or killing a person for a tennis shoe. This shows the presence of addiction. The final sign is escalation toward death. An example is how we see more and more natural resources necessary for maintaining organic systems, including human beings, which are disappearing. More and more of these resources are disappearing on Earth. In this escalation toward the death of the world, we can recognize the presence of syndromes of addiction. We've seen various examples of how systemic addiction to rewards and punishment develops. We can improve this situation by not giving rewards and not threatening with any punishments. In order to do this, a person has to know how to distinguish between a natural result and a reward or punishment that is artificially manipulated. The solution is very radical, but that is how I see it. So that's the end of that paper, and this goes back about four different videos, so if you watch them all at one time, it might make more sense. Now I'd like to continue talking about the same subject with some notes I have. An example of a reward today could be a deal made without consideration of the general common good of a group. It could be, for example, in a big city. Such deals could be made by a real estate business owner and an alderman. Each would be rewarded. The alderman might be his re-election might be helped by this real estate. He might give a big amount toward the re-election of the alderman. That could be his reward, and it could be the reward to the real estate agent owner would be to be allowed to earn money at the city's expense, but it would not be agreed upon by the whole city. It wouldn't even be known about by most people in the city, and it wouldn't be for the good of the city. It probably wouldn't. I don't know the details, but chances are he would be getting a very good deal. This real estate person would be getting too much money for whatever he is doing. Sometimes the money comes from the federal government, and so it wouldn't be good for the whole country either, because everybody's paying those taxes. Another example could be in a city when there's something that isn't good, which some outsider wants, and an alderman would be bribed in order to vote for it. And maybe his vote is the important vote. So an outsider gives him money. It could come in the form again of paying for his election campaign coming up. And he would vote for it. And it wouldn't be for the good of the city, but his individual reward he would think of as that money. And the outsider would get his reward, whatever it is he wants. It's important when seeking a solution to rewards and punishment not to accept rewards individually when they're not in the interest of the complex group which is involved. This is because the more complex group pays, and so accepting it is divisive. The rest of the group is hurt if we accept on an individual level a reward for something which is not for the common good of the whole group. The reason, and we don't want this divisiveness, we don't want to be divided from the group, and the reason we want unity for the group is that all of reality is unified. We're part of everything. We're even part of our opponent. What we're seeking is the common good of everything, which would be the more complex system, not our own individual group, our own individual good. But the larger, more complex system is more important. But there are times when the common good is sought when the more complex system, let's say a family, suffers for the less. Let's say a sick child. That's because the interest of the less complex, the child's health, is in the interest of the more complex, which is the family. So the common good has to do with that individual good. So each case has to be studied very carefully to see the common good of the larger and larger system. Each system is part of a larger system. So that larger system is the most important. The good, because it's, well, not larger, let's say each one is part of a more complex system. And that complex system is more important, whatever is for the good of that more complex system. And very often the good of the individual system is for the good. An individual system could be for the good of that more complex system. But when we pay off aldermen or pay off real estate interests, this is very often not for the good of the more complex whole city, which is much more complex than one real estate, the good or the money that a real estate gets. That real estate could probably survive without so much money. At times, the solution to the rewards and punishment culture is resistance. But there is a process to group resistance. First, we must identify the problem, and this can be very hard because rewards and punishments come in such a variety of ways, and sometimes they're very subtle. A very subtle hint of a bribe or a hint of a punishment. It could be a threat of a punishment. It can be very subtle, and we have to identify that first. The second step is communication, which is very important. We have to communicate with the opposition, with the ones that we want to resist if necessary. And this can be very difficult also. They may be at such a high level, the opposition, that we can hardly get an appointment with them or can't communicate with them because they're too high up and we're too low. Or another problem could be that some people just refuse to talk. Our opposition might say, no, I don't want to talk about it. And those are very difficult things to try to get them to talk to us. But once communication starts, the solution can be very simple. There could be just a misunderstanding. So we do have to try to communicate. Once you understand what the problem is, it can be fixed very easily once they understand the misunderstanding. But it only comes with communication. But the final step, if the communication does not work, the final step is the resistance. And it should be nonviolent resistance, and we should be very aware of the effect on the opposition. If we have a bad effect and we're hurting our opposition, we should stop. We should be very careful not to hurt the opposition in the process. As what happened one time with Gandhi, he stopped a whole resistance project that he had because he realized he was hurting his opposition. There could be a lot of suffering on our side, the resistors' side. But the reason it's worth it is because there would be more suffering if we didn't resist. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you for listening.